What enemy requires the longest stall? That's a question that came from a more basic one, and that's what's the most damage a character can do in a single hit, let's say. That's not a very interesting question nowadays because there's two obvious answers, one for EN and one for CN, and this is June of 2026, so you can work out spoilers for yourself. The question of what stall is the hardest is where things get interesting, because this is down to a little more than just how much damage per hit one character can do. This is down to DPS itself, or just the nature of stalling. Usually it's down to the scale of what you're trying to stall. For example, stalling a few seconds to get a skill up is different from stalling a boss while the burst goes through, which is also different from what we're looking at, in which what is the most amount of time you need to take to kill something? As in, you are trying your best to defeat them, and yet it still takes ridiculously long. If you watch me on Twitch, you already know where this is going. RACC. Unlike normal RA, enemies in RACC scale infinitely based on day count. If someone spent literally all their time on this mode playing as quickly and efficiently as possible, then they wouldn't reach infinity, but frankly they'd see absurd enemy stats. I am not this person. To some degree I am, but when I say literally all their time, I do not mean 8-hour streams of just this mode. I mean every waking second of your being. I'm nearing day 2000 at time of writing. At day 2k, enemies should have around 43 times their usual attack, defense, and HP. Defense is important for KLB math, and HP is important for that aforementioned CN operator. But to put that into perspective, one of these cute little critters has 3000 HP normally. At day 2000, one would have 129,600 HP. The first boss of IS6, Yi, has 150,000 HP at base, but he's the final boss, not a normal enemy. And there's a max to how much that number can grow at max IS difficulty and with certain things in the IS itself. These rodents though come in packs of at least 45, often over 100, and that's at day 2000. 2000 is not at all close to infinity. Every in-game day that passes, their stats grow bigger until end of service itself. And I'm not implying that Arknights is gonna EOS anytime soon, I'm saying this scaling goes for that long. That brings us back to the title question. As of now, June 2026, what enemy currently in the game requires you to stall for the longest period of time? This isn't regular pointless stalling, such as using a Black Knight skill 1 on a Sarcast Sentinel to see how long infinite duration skills actually last. They last 50 hours, by the way. If you're actually trying to defeat an enemy in the quickest way possible, which enemy ends up being the toughest? I'm sure there's already a few comments referencing Kyostin V or some other streamer or content creator leaving a pinch out stall on in the background while they go play League of Legends or some other game. To most somewhat aware Arknights players, that's probably the limit, but we're not the average Arknights players here. Pinch out stalls might have been the longest back then, but that was before RACC or even RA2 at all. What is it now? This is where I have to properly address the CN operator, so CN spoilers. For the next Sui event, we are getting Chen the Dawnstrig, who I will arbitrarily call Cinnamon from this point on. KLB and Cinnamon are the current forerunners in DPS since both directly scale off enemy stats. KLB talent uses enemy defense, Cinnamon skill 3 uses enemy's current HP percentage. Since all relevant stats scale by the percentage, the math works out in a way where KLB effectively does max percent HP, albeit often rather small. For enemies with higher defense compared to their HP, an unbuffed KLB will always shred huge amounts, sometimes over 10% of their max HP. For enemies with relatively high HP compared to their defense, however, KLB might need to land hundreds if not thousands of attacks to kill, but the part that matters is the amount of hits never actually changes. Technically it does early on when her normal regular attack damage still matters, but after 1,000 days, let's say, basically all damage is going to come from that talent. Cinnamon is not like this. Cinnamon uses the enemy's current HP to calculate damage and will at base cleave off 6% per hit. This means that the first few attacks will usually do loads more than KOB can against the same target, but technically, Cinnamon does eventually need to land more hits in the long term to defeat the same targets. The interesting part here is that long term is possibly in the hundreds of thousands of days, and each time Chen gets weaker by a slightly smaller amount. I wouldn't be surprised if it took until day count in the quadrillions for KOB to finally need less hits than Cinnamon, and it's a good time to remind you that, as of current, I and Entropy Arknights are hovering around day 2000 after going at it for about a year and a half. Speaking of, Entropy has a good video explaining why Cinnamon is so game-breaking, and you should really check it out. I rely on their RACC for Massacre spreadsheet a lot, so go check them out if you are more interested in the actual weeds and numbers. If you're curious about highest damage in a single hit, it goes to Cinnamon, since the RA bosses have the most HP in the mode, but they don't have that much relative defense, so the first hit of Cinnamon's S3 will always take the crown. Now that the stage is set, we need to find out who can disrupt it the best. We are working in RACC and our best damage dealers are KOB and Cinnamon. There's two ways of looking at this, and both poke at one of these operators. Let's assume we're actually on day infinity and enemies have infinite defense. In this situation, Cinnamon can never kill anything. She's exceptionally good at lowering enemies down, specifically all the way to about 2% of their max HP, but 2% of infinity is still infinity. After each dragon, the enemy's HP will be infinitesimally smaller, but still not low enough to get Cinnamon's base damage to finish the job. That means that we only really need to worry about KOB here. KOB will be doing infinite damage per hit, and while the term infinite muddies the discussion since you can't really kill something with infinite HP, remember how this works in reality. If on day 1000, KOB takes 50 hits to kill something, then on day 1 billion, KOB will still take 50 hits to kill something. This goes all the way to, let's say, day 1 Google, when KOB will still take 50 hits. One hit will do insane amounts of damage, but it will still take exactly 50. While again, infinity is a hard amount to justify, I believe that an enemy that dies in 50 hits when it has infinite HP will still die in 50 hits to KOB. Maybe an actual mathematician specializing in infinity and beyond can correct me, but for the sake of this argument, that holds true. So that's it, isn't it? At the end of time itself, KOB will always beat everything because her infinite damage, based on their infinite defense, keeps up with their infinite HP. The notion is true, but there's a caveat in there. KOB does not directly do infinite damage based on HP. It's based on their defense. So if an enemy has no defense, then you can see where this is going. Infused originium slubs, or exploding spiders as everyone calls them, appear somewhat commonly in this mode. They're some of the weakest enemies around, in part thanks to their lack of defense, but in this hypothetical, that lack of defense is the one thing keeping them alive. Against them, KOB, like everyone else, has to attack an infinite number of times to defeat them, so the only real way to win against them is to use a hole. Technically, the little spawns from originium dust spiders also have 0 defense, but you can just silence those guys and then the little spawnlings won't appear, so we can just ignore those guys. But because the exploding spiders have their own dedicated raid, on day infinity, they become the most threatening enemies. That's in hypothetical land though. What about real life? If we were to choose some random day, no matter how big or small, would they still be a problem? Alone? No. We can turn to Cinnamon now. As mentioned before, she can, in one skill, reduce most enemies down to 2% of their max HP if we ignore res. And because HP isn't infinite anymore, that HP value will eventually reach Cinnamon's attack value, meaning her actual attack can kill. As long as the HP is a finite number, it can eventually be reduced to the point where enemies can be defeated. However, we are still in RACC, and RACC has rules that we need to respect. The important one here is the axe system. Each day in RA is made up of 2 acts, and you can only use one operator once per day, meaning you cannot use them for both acts. This is why Our Feek was so scary before Cinnamon came out. If you wasted KOB because you messed up the combat or weren't paying attention or your game crashed, then there's no recourse. You're just screwed. Without KOB, there is no way to beat Our Feek past day 200 or so. Our Feek is a boss that has 2 phases, but if you don't manage to kill phase 2 in time, the boss goes back to phase 1, kind of like Blood Knight from Near Light, but the point is that it's a DPS check effectively, which of course gets harder when everything scales infinitely. Now, going back to the spiders, just like how there's only one KOB, we only have one Cinnamon. Well, technically there's 3 Chens, and we sent a 4th one to Talos 2 for good measure, but there's only one that could do current percent HP damage. There is a boss called Ruinbringer that spawns exploding spiders, but in actuality, you don't actually have to defeat those spiders. As long as you beat all the enemies and the boss, you can just leave the stage and the spiders will not count. You know what will screw you over though? 2 spider raids. Yeah, the spider raid is a normal raid, you can just get multiple of them. So if you happen to get 2 at the same time, then good luck. You'll never actually lose to these spiders since you can always follow them towards your base and fight them there, but that doesn't stop them from being annoying up until. And that is my argument for the hardest stall in Arknights. Some really high day in RACC where you need to fight 2 different spider raids and there's no hole on either. If you have a better idea, hit me with it. I can't be correct on this, someone's gonna prove me wrong at some point.